Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the McMinnville UFO photographs. We begin our journey by traveling back in time, far away from the hum of modern electronics and the glow of city lights. Imagine yourself standing in the rolling hills of the Willamette Valley in Oregon. The air is cool and carries the scent of damp earth and blooming wildflowers. The year is 1950. It is a Thursday, the 11th of May, and the day is slowly surrendering to the evening. The world here moves at a different pace. It is a world of wooden fences, gravel roads, and the steady rhythm of farm life. In the small town of Sheridan, just outside of McMinnville, the sun is beginning its descent toward the Coast Range, casting long, amber shadows across the fields. The light is soft, filtered through a light layer of clouds, creating a silver-gray canopy that stretches from horizon to horizon. This is the world of Paul and Evelyn Trent, a couple whose names would soon be whispered in every household across the nation. Evelyn Trent is a woman of routine and quiet strength. On this particular evening, at approximately 7:30, she is attending to her final chores of the day. The farmhouse behind her is a place of modest comfort, a sanctuary of simple living. She carries a heavy bucket of feed, the grain rustling softly as she moves toward the back of the property. Her destination is the row of cages where the family rabbits are kept. Can you hear the soft, rhythmic sound of her footsteps on the grass? Can you smell the sweet aroma of dry hay? For Evelyn, this is a moment of peace. The day's hard work is almost over, and the twilight brings a sense of calm. She reaches the cages, the wire mesh cold beneath her fingers. The rabbits move toward her, their small noses twitching in anticipation of their meal. There is a gentle domesticity here, a profound sense of safety and normalcy that makes what is about to happen feel even more surreal. As Evelyn works, the animals remain strangely calm. Later, people would ask if the dogs barked or if the chickens fluttered in alarm, but Evelyn would remember only the silence. The world around her is perfectly still. She bends down to fill a feeder, her mind perhaps wandering to thoughts of dinner or the upcoming weekend. But as she stands back up, something draws her gaze toward the northeast. At first, it might have been just a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a stray reflection of the setting sun. But as she focuses her vision, she realizes that the sky is no longer empty. High above the horizon, moving with a slow and deliberate grace, is an object that defies every rule of the world she knows. It is not a bird, and it certainly isn't one of the small prop planes that occasionally buzz over the valley. It is something entirely different. It is silent, gliding through the air without the roar of an engine or the whistle of wind against wings. Evelyn stands frozen, the bucket of feed still heavy in her hand. She watches as the object approaches, her eyes widening in a mixture of confusion and awe. The shape is unmistakable. It is a large, metallic disc, gleaming with a dull, ethereal light. To Evelyn, it looks like a giant, inverted plate or a Chinese coolie hat. It has a bronze hue on its upper surface, while the underside appears to be a shimmering, polished silver. It tilts slightly as it moves, as if balancing on an invisible current of air. There is no exhaust, no smoke, and no sign of a cockpit or a pilot. It is a pure, geometric anomaly against the darkening Oregon sky. She watches it for several long seconds, her heart beginning to throb in her chest. The sheer scale of it is overwhelming. It is not a toy or a trick of the light. It is a physical structure, several dozen feet in diameter, claiming the airspace above her home as if it belongs there. The object continues its steady, westward drift, moving with a haunting smoothness. Evelyn realizes she cannot keep this sight to herself. She needs a witness. She needs to know that what she is seeing is real. Breaking her silence, she turns back toward the farmhouse and begins to call out for her husband. "Paul, Paul." Her voice cuts through the quiet evening air, urgent and sharp. She drops the bucket, the grains spilling onto the grass, forgotten. She doesn't take her eyes off the disc for more than a second, terrified that it might vanish as quickly as it appeared. She scrambles toward the back door, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Inside the house, Paul Trent is winding down from his own day of labor, unaware that the quiet life they have built together is about to be interrupted by a mystery that will endure for over 70 years. He hears the panic in his wife's voice and moves toward the door, his hand already reaching for the latch. The sun sinks lower, the shadows deepen, and the silver disc glides closer, waiting to be immortalized. Inside the farmhouse, the evening had been unfolding with the predictable rhythm of a Thursday in May. Paul Trent was likely occupied with the small, quiet tasks that fill the end of a farmer's day, perhaps resting in the kitchen or attending to a chore in the back of the house. The air was still, carrying the scent of damp soil and the fading warmth of a spring sun that had already dipped below the horizon. Then, the silence was shattered. It wasn't a scream of terror that reached him, but a sharp, urgent command from Evelyn that cut through the domestic quiet. She was calling for him, her voice urgent and breathless, telling him to get the camera. There was a specific quality to her tone that bypassed any need for explanation. Paul didn't pause to ask what she had seen. He moved with a sudden, focused energy, his boots heavy on the floorboards as he reached for their reliable Kodak Roamer 1. The camera was a folding model, a sturdy piece of machinery with black leather bellows that expanded like an accordion when opened. Paul was a man of great economy, a frugal farmer who didn't believe in wasting a single frame of film. That roll of black and white film inside the Kodak had been there for months. It held a few exposures from the previous winter, frozen moments of a snow scene, and a single shot of a weeping willow tree taken just a few weeks prior in April. There were only a few frames left on the roll, intended perhaps for a family picnic on Mother's Day. But in the urgency of the moment, the value of the film was forgotten. He gripped the cold metal and leather of the device, his thumb finding the familiar curves of the housing, and he hurried toward the back door, stepping out into the cooling twilight of the yard. As he crossed the threshold, the world seemed to have changed. The rabbits and chickens that Evelyn had been tending were unusually quiet, as if the natural world was holding its breath. Paul followed Evelyn's gaze upward. There, suspended in the darkening sky to the northeast, was the object. It was massive, a metallic, disc-shaped craft that defied every rule of aviation he knew. It didn't have wings, nor did it have the roaring engines of the planes that occasionally hummed over the Oregon countryside. It was a dull, polished silver, reflecting the last of the bronze light from the sunset. It moved with a terrifying grace, a slow, steady glide that felt more like drifting than flying. Paul felt the weight of the camera in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly as he realized he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. He took a moment to steady himself, planting his feet on the uneven ground near the back porch. The object was approaching from the northeast, moving toward them with a ghostly silence. He raised the Kodak Roamer, squinting through the small viewfinder. He framed the scene as best he could, the silhouette of the farm's power lines cutting across the top of his vision. The craft was tilted slightly, showing a distinct superstructure or turret on its top. He held his breath, the world narrowing down to the silver shape in the glass. He pressed the shutter. A sharp, mechanical click echoed in the quiet yard, the sound of 1950 technology capturing an anomaly from another world. The first photograph was taken at approximately 7:30 p.m., a single moment frozen in silver halide. But the object didn't stop. It began to accelerate, banking away toward the west and northwest. Paul knew he had to be faster than the machine's departure. His thumbs worked the manual film advance dial, his skin catching on the ridged metal as he cranked the film forward for the next exposure. Every second felt elongated, the mechanical resistance of the camera feeling like an eternity as the craft gained speed. He realized that the garage was going to block his view if he stayed put. Shouting for Evelyn to watch, he scrambled to his right, his boots kicking up dust as he ran several yards to get a clearer angle. He was chasing a ghost in the sky, his heart hammering against his ribs as he desperately tried to keep the metallic disc within his sights before it disappeared forever into the gathering mist. He stopped, braced himself again, and raised the camera once more. The object was now further away, appearing smaller but no less real. It had leveled out, its bronze-tinted underside catching a different angle of the evening light. He clicked the shutter for the second time. That second frame captured the craft as it moved toward the horizon, positioned between the edge of the family garage and a distant line of trees. Within less than 30 seconds, the entire encounter reached its climax. The object put on a sudden burst of speed, gliding silently into the western sky until it was nothing more than a speck, and then it was gone. Paul lowered the camera, the metal now warm from his grip. He and Evelyn stood in the deepening shadows of the farm, the only sound being the distant evening wind, left with 2 clicks of a shutter and a mystery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The metallic scent of the evening air seemed to linger in the yard, even after the object had vanished beyond the western horizon. Paul stood there for a long moment, the Kodak Roamer 1 camera feeling heavy and cold in his hands, his finger still resting near the shutter button. The farm had returned to its natural, heavy silence. The rabbits in their wooden cages had settled back into their straw, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic lowing of a cow from a neighboring field across the valley. It was as if the sky had pulled a heavy curtain shut, leaving the world exactly as it had been before the silver disc appeared. He turned back toward the house, his heavy boots crunching softly on the dry dirt. Evelyn was waiting by the door, her breath still coming in shallow hitches, her eyes wide with the reflection of the fading twilight. They did not speak as they stepped inside the kitchen. The familiar warmth of the wood stove and the mundane smell of a cooking dinner felt strangely thin, like a stage set that might collapse at any moment. For the next several days, a single wooden drawer in the hallway became a focal point of unspoken tension. In the year 1950, life in a rural pocket of Oregon like Sheridan was measured by the turning of the seasons and the demands of the chores, not by cosmic interruptions. As they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the silence between them was thicker than usual. Paul and Evelyn were simple, hard-working people who valued their privacy and their local reputation for honesty above all else. They began to talk in hushed tones late at night, when the house was dark and the wind whistled through the eaves, about what they had actually seen. Paul's mind kept returning to the government. This was the era of the early Cold War, a time of secret projects and hushed whispers about what might be flying through American airspace. They wondered if they had witnessed something they were never meant to see. Perhaps it was not a visitor from another world, but a classified military craft from their own country. The thought did not bring them comfort. It brought a cold, sharp fear of the unknown authorities. Beyond the fear of potential trouble, there was also the matter of practical, rural frugality. Paul was a man who did not believe in waste, and every penny was accounted for on the farm. The Kodak Roamer was loaded with a roll of black and white film that held 8 exposures. Before that strange evening, he had only used a few. He had taken a picture of a deep snow scene earlier that year, and another of the weeping willow tree that stood in their front yard. On that late afternoon of May 11th, he had clicked the shutter twice more to capture the silver disc. That left several frames still unused on the spool. To Paul, the idea of developing a roll of film that was not finished was unthinkable. It was a waste of perfectly good film and hard-earned money. So the camera sat in the dark of the drawer, nestled between spare keys and old farm receipts, while the potential proof of a century-defining event remained curled in a tight, light-sensitive spiral. It is haunting to imagine those 2 images of the silver craft, sitting, just inches away from them while they slept, invisible and dormant in the dark. Life, however, does not stop for the extraordinary. The cows still needed milking at dawn, the rabbits needed their daily feeding, and the cycle of the farm continued its steady march. 3 days passed after the sighting, bringing them to May 14th, 1950. It was Mother's Day. The Trent house filled with the sounds of family as relatives gathered for a celebratory picnic. There were children laughing in the yard, and the rhythmic clink of silverware against porcelain plates. In the midst of the celebration, Paul took the camera out of the drawer once more. To any onlooker, he was just a father and a husband capturing the mundane beauty of a family gathering in the spring sun. He used the remaining 3 frames on his roll to take pictures of the picnic and the people he loved. The contrast is staggering to consider. On one single strip of celluloid, there was now a sequence of history. A winter snow, a willow tree, an unidentified craft from the stars, and finally, a family eating lunch together on the grass. The extraordinary and the ordinary were entwined on a single roll of film. Even after the roll was finally finished, the hesitation remained like a shadow in the house. The fear of government trouble was a heavy cloak that Paul could not quite shake off. He imagined men in dark suits arriving at his door, demanding the film, or worse, accusing him of a malicious hoax. He was a man of the earth, and the sky had suddenly become a source of profound anxiety for him. The finished roll of film was removed from the camera and tucked away again, this time sitting in the shadows of the drawer for even longer. It would be nearly 2 weeks before Paul finally decided to see what he had captured. He did not rush to a newspaper or a laboratory in the city. Instead, he treated it like any other roll of film from any other year. He waited until his next necessary trip into town, carrying the small metal canister in his pocket like a heavy stone. The walk to the local drugstore was a quiet one, the weight of the secret pressing against his leg with every step he took down the street. When he finally handed the film over the counter at the pharmacy, he said nothing of what he suspected was on it. He simply asked for it to be developed and printed, just as he had done dozens of times before. The clerk took the canister with a polite nod, entirely unaware that they were holding what many would later call the most significant evidence of a flying saucer ever recorded by a civilian. Paul walked back out into the bright light of day, feeling a strange mixture of relief and renewed dread. The images were no longer in his possession. They were out in the world, undergoing a slow chemical transformation in a darkroom. Soon, the silver grains on the paper would reveal whether the thing they saw was truly there, or if the evening light of May 11th had played a trick on their tired eyes. He drove back to the farm where Evelyn was waiting, both of them suspended in a state of quiet, nervous anticipation, waiting for the shadows of that evening to finally take a permanent, physical shape. The roll of film sat in the dark heart of the Kodak camera for nearly a month. To Paul and Evelyn, the memories of that evening on May 11th were already beginning to feel like a dream, something that might have dissolved into the Oregon mist if not for the physical weight of the film still tucked inside the machine. Life on the farm did not pause for mysteries. There were fences to mend, rabbits to feed, and the steady, rhythmic demands of the spring season. They waited, not out of indifference, but out of a deep-seated caution. They had already whispered to one another about the possibility that they had seen something they were not meant to see, perhaps a secret government craft or a military experiment from the nearby bases. In those days of 1950, the shadow of the Great War was still long, and the Cold War was beginning to chill the air. To hold such images was to hold a potential kind of trouble that a quiet farming family simply did not want. It was not until Mother's Day, just 3 days after the sighting, that the remaining frames on the roll were finally used. Imagine the scene, a soft Sunday afternoon where the family gathered for a picnic. They took photos of the children playing, the weeping willow tree in the front yard, and the simple joys of a holiday. These mundane, happy moments shared space on the same strip of celluloid as the metallic intruder. Paul finally took the roll to the local pharmacy in McMinnville, handing it over the counter with a steady hand that betrayed nothing of the electricity hummed beneath his skin. He did not ask for a rush job. He did not tell the clerk that tucked between the family snapshots were 2 frames that would eventually challenge the scientific community for decades. He simply walked back out to his truck, the bell of the shop door chiming behind him, and drove back to the silence of the Sheridan countryside. When the day finally came to pick up the prints, the air was thick with the scent of damp soil and blooming clover. Paul stepped back into the pharmacy and received a simple, rectangular envelope. It felt light, yet the air in the small shop seemed to press in on him as he walked back to the cab of his pickup truck. He did not open them immediately. He let the envelope rest on the bench seat beside him, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden fingers across the paper. It was only when he returned to the farmhouse, sitting at the sturdy wooden kitchen table with Evelyn, that the seal was finally broken. The sound of the paper tearing was sharp in the quiet room. He slid the stack of black and white prints out, the smell of chemical developer rising up like a phantom from the darkroom. They flipped through the picnic photos first, the smiling faces of their kin blurred slightly by the simple lens. Then the world seemed to go still. There it was. In the first frame, the sky was a pale, grainy gray, but suspended beneath the dark line of the telephone wire was a clear, sharp, discoidal shape. It looked solid, heavy, and undeniably metallic. In the second photo, the object had tilted, revealing a small superstructure on top, a subtle dome that caught the light in a way that made it seem three-dimensional and massive. Evelyn leaned in close, her eyes tracing the outline of the silver craft she had stood beneath just weeks before. In the stillness of their kitchen, the reality was far more jarring than the memory. On paper, the object didn't fade or flicker. It remained, a silent witness to a moment that defied every law of the familiar world. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely rising above the ticking of the wall clock. What were they supposed to do with such things? They were farmers, not scientists. They were neighbors, not newsmakers. For a short time, the photos remained a secret held close to their chests. They were placed on a shelf, tucked away like a family secret that was too heavy to carry alone. Eventually, Paul felt he needed a second opinion, a steady mind to look at what he had captured. He reached out to a trusted friend, Frank Wertman, who was a local banker in McMinnville. Frank was a man of business and logic, someone who dealt in hard numbers and verifiable truths. When Paul laid the prints out on the banker's desk, the atmosphere changed. Frank did not laugh. He did not dismiss the images as a prank or a trick of the light. He stared at them for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. He recognized the honesty in Paul's face, the same honesty that had guided their business dealings for years. Frank was so struck by the clarity of the images that he asked to display them in the window of the bank. That bank window became the first stage for the McMinnville mystery. Passers-by would stop, their boots clicking on the sidewalk, and lean in to see the strange, silvery disk hovering over the Trent farm. The reactions were a mixture of awe and skepticism, but the word began to spread through the town like a slow-burning fuse. People who knew the Trents knew they were not given to tall tailies. They were reliable, hard-working people who preferred the company of their livestock to the spotlight. Yet, as more people gathered at the window, the secret was no longer theirs alone. The negatives, those precious strips of film that held the original light of that May evening, were brought home and, in the chaotic way of a busy household, were eventually tucked under the davenport. There, among the dust motes and the shadows, they were found by the children, who played with them as if they were nothing more than scraps of plastic, unaware that they held the most famous images of the 20th century. The quiet was ending. The world was about to come knocking at the farmhouse door. The newsroom of the telephone register was a place of steady, rhythmic noise, and the heavy, metallic scent of printer's ink. In June of 1950, McMinnville was a town where the news moved at a human pace, measured by the clicking of typewriters and the low hum of the linotype machine in the back. Bill Powell, a local reporter and editor with a keen eye for the pulse of Yamhill County, sat at his desk, likely unaware that the morning air was about to shift. He was a man who understood the people of this valley. He knew their faces, their harvests, and their silences. When he first heard whispers of the strange images sitting in a bank window downtown, he didn't dismiss them as many others might have. He felt a tug of curiosity, a professional instinct that suggested there was something more than a mere prank behind the glass of the First National Bank. The town was small enough that news of a flying saucer didn't just spread. It seeped into the very floorboards of the local shops. As we recalled, the banker Frank Wertman had been the first to give the photos a public stage. But it was Bill Powell who saw the potential for a story that would transcend the city limits. After seeing the prints himself, Powell decided he needed to find the source. He climbed into his car and drove southwest towards Sheridan, passing rows of walnut trees and the verdant, rolling hills of the countryside. He was looking for the Trent farm. When he pulled up to the modest house, he found Paul and Evelyn Trent, a couple whose lives were built on the hard, honest work of the land. They were not people who sought the spotlight. In fact, they were deeply hesitant. They told Powell they feared the photographs might bring them trouble from the government, believing the silver disc they had captured might have been a secret military project that they were never meant to see. Powell had to speak softly, reassuring them that their story deserved to be told with dignity. The negotiation for the negatives was a delicate dance of trust. Paul Trent eventually reached into a drawer and produced the precious strips of film, still tucked away as if they were something dangerous. Powell held them up to the light, his eyes narrow and focused. He wasn't just looking at pictures, he was looking for the truth of the moment. He saw the grainy texture of the sky and the sharp, unmistakable silhouette of the craft hanging above the farm. Back at the newspaper office, the investigation grew more intense. Powell was no stranger to the tricks of the darkroom, yet as he enlarged the images every which way, he couldn't find a single trace of a wire, a thread, or any sign of a double exposure. The negatives were clean. The shadows on the ground and the light reflecting off the metallic surface of the object seemed to match the time of day the Trents described. For a seasoned newsman, the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The atmosphere in the telephone register office reached a fever pitch as the deadline for the June 8th edition approached. Powell worked on his lead, careful to maintain a balance between wonder and journalistic skepticism. He titled the piece with a question that would echo through history. At long last, authentic photographs of flying saucer. He detailed the account of Evelyn feeding her rabbits at 7:30 in the evening on May 11th, and the frantic seconds that followed as Paul grabbed his Kodak camera. Powell wrote about the honesty he felt in their voices, a quality that was difficult to fake. As the presses began to roll, the smell of fresh ink grew thick. The machines clattered and groaned, churning out hundreds of copies that would soon be bundled and tossed onto front porches across the county. This was the moment the secret of the Trent farm was finally unleashed upon the world, and there was no going back. When the sun rose on that Thursday morning in June, the people of McMinnville woke to a front page that looked unlike any they had seen before. Two large, black-and-white images dominated the paper, showing a clear, structured disc tilting in the sky near a power line. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The telephone register, a modest local publication, suddenly became the center of a national whirlwind. Bill Powell's phone began to ring incessantly. Other news agencies, including the International News Service, caught wind of the story and demanded copies of the photos. Within hours, the tale of the quiet farming couple and their visitor from the stars was being transmitted over wire services to every corner of the country. Powell had intended to document a local curiosity, but he had accidentally tapped into a deep, collective fascination with the unknown. The quiet streets of McMinnville were about to be filled with strangers, reporters, and investigators, all drawn by the ink on a page. By the time the story reached the offices of Life magazine later that month, the McMinnville photographs had already become a phenomenon. But for Bill Powell, the most striking part of the entire ordeal remained the character of the Trents themselves. Despite the mounting pressure and the sudden intrusion of the world into their private lives, they never changed their story. They never asked for money. They sat on their porch as the summer heat began to settle over Oregon, watching the same sky they had photographed a few weeks earlier. The paper they held in their hands, with its bold headlines and grainy pictures, was a testament to a moment that changed everything for them. Powell had captured a piece of history, but as the ink dried and the news spread, even he couldn't have predicted how long these images would haunt the imagination of the world. The mystery was no longer a local secret. It was a national obsession, floating just out of reach, high above the silent fields. The quiet of the Trent farm was never quite the same after that first week of June. What had begun as a shared secret between a husband and wife, then a story whispered among neighbors in McMinnville, was about to be swept up into the grand, heavy machinery of mid-century American media. It was the 1950s, an era where the printed word and the glossy photograph held an almost sacred authority over the public imagination. When the offices of Life magazine in New York City took notice of the two frames captured on May 11th, the world began to tilt on its axis for Paul and Evelyn. This was no longer just a curious tale from the outskirts of a small Oregon town. It was becoming a national focal point, a window through which millions would peer, searching for something beyond the ordinary in the vast, blue sky. On June 26, 1950, the issue finally hit the stands. Imagine the physical weight of that magazine in your hands, thick, heavy paper that smelled faintly of chemicals, cedar, and fresh press ink. For many Americans, Life was their primary connection to the wider world, a source of absolute truth captured in sharp shades of black, white, and gray. As the pages turned, past reports of international conflict, fashion trends, and domestic novelties, readers eventually reached page 40. There, nestled among the ordinary events of a summer week, was the headline that would cement the Trent name in history forever. It read simply, "Farmer Trent sees flying saucer." It was a direct and unassuming statement, but it carried the weight of a quiet revelation that rippled through living rooms across the continent. The spread featured the two photographs, cropped and sharpened for the eyes of the public. In these printed versions, the object looked more defined than ever. It hung in the sky with a silent, heavy presence, its metallic sheen seemingly catching the soft, late-day light of the Oregon hills. The magazine described it as resembling a silver Chinese coolie hat, a saucer-shaped craft with a small tower or antenna visible on its top. It did not look like a bird, a weather balloon, or any aircraft known to the civilians of 1950. It looked purposeful. It looked solid. Beside the images was a portrait of Paul Trent himself, standing outside in his work clothes, holding the small camera that had captured the impossible. His face was that of a modest man, someone who had simply been in the right place at a very strange time. The impact of those pages reaching the public was immediate and overwhelming for the family. For the Trents, the simple privacy of their farm vanished almost overnight. The dirt road leading to their home, once quiet and predictable, began to churn with the tires of cars from faraway places. Telegrams arrived in thick bundles, and the telephone, when they could get to it, rang incessantly with the voices of reporters, scientists, and the deeply curious. People wanted to know what it felt like to stand in that backyard and see the unknown. They wanted to know if the metal had hummed, if the air had grown cold, or if the birds had fallen silent. Paul and Evelyn, who had never sought the spotlight, found themselves the reluctant caretakers of a global mystery that refused to go away. Behind the sudden fame, a quieter tension was brewing regarding the physical evidence itself. To publish the photos with such clarity, Life magazine had requested the original negatives. These were the thin, translucent strips of film that held the primary truth of the event. Paul had handed them over with the understanding that they would be returned once the issue was printed. However, as weeks turned into months, the negatives did not come back. The magazine eventually claimed they had been misplaced, lost in the vast, labyrinthine archives of the New York offices. For a farmer who valued his property and his word above all else, this loss was a heavy blow. It added a layer of shadow to the story, a lingering question of whether the disappearance was an accident or something more deliberate. Even without the physical negatives, the images remained burned into the collective consciousness of the era. They became the gold standard for what a flying saucer was supposed to look like. Across the country, children looked to the stars with new eyes, and adults found themselves pausing during their evening chores, wondering if a silver disk might glide over their own rooftops. The McMinnville photos had provided a visual language for a new kind of wonder. The Trent farm was no longer just a place of grain and livestock. It was a landmark of the unexplained, a spot on the map where the curtain of the everyday had been pulled back just far enough to let the light of another world shine through. The world was watching, and the mystery was only just beginning. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. The quietude of the Trent farm was a fragile thing, held together by the rhythmic chores of rural life and the vast, damp silence of the Oregon countryside. For a short time after the sighting on May 11th, 1950, that silence remained unbroken. The photographs sat in the camera, undeveloped, tucked away like a secret neither Paul nor Evelyn was quite ready to confront. They went about their days, feeding the rabbits and the chickens, the memory of the silver disk hovering in the sky as heavy as the low-hanging clouds. But once the film was developed and the local newspaper, the telephone register, shared those two startling frames with the world, the peace of their sanctuary began to fray. The story was no longer theirs alone. It had leaked out from the valley, traveling like a wildfire through the wires of news agencies, until it reached the glossy pages of Life magazine on June 26, 1950. Suddenly, the eyes of the entire world were focused on a small patch of dirt and gravel in the Pacific Northwest. Imagine the sound of tires on gravel, a sound that usually meant a neighbor or a friend was pulling up for a visit. Now, that sound became a constant, grating presence. Cars began to line the narrow road leading to the farm, their engines idling as strangers leaned out of windows to point at the sky or the garage roof. People came from across the state, then from across the country, driven by a feverish curiosity that the Trents had never invited. They were simple farmers, people who measured their success by the health of their livestock and the yield of their garden, not by the number of flashbulbs popping in their faces. The weight of this scrutiny began to press down on them. Every time they stepped out of their front door, they were met with a barrage of questions. Scientists, reporters, and the deeply obsessed all wanted the same thing: a piece of the mystery that Paul and Evelyn had captured in 30 seconds of frantic movement. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being watched. The Trents felt it in their bones. They were poked and prodded by the intellects of the era, asked to repeat their story hundreds of times until the words began to lose their meaning. Yet, through it all, they remained remarkably consistent. They spoke of the metallic sheen of the craft, the way it tilted in the air, and the absolute silence of its flight. Even as the skeptics began to sharpen their knives, suggesting that the whole thing was a clever hoax involving a car mirror or a garbage can lid, the Trents did not waver. They didn't have the temperament for complex lies. They were people of the earth, grounded and direct. When the visitors asked to see where Evelyn had been standing when she first saw the object, she would lead them to the rabbit hutch, her voice calm and weary, retracing her steps over the same soil she walked every single day. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the aftermath was the Trents' absolute refusal to profit from their fame. In an era where a sensational story could be traded for a small fortune, Paul and Evelyn turned their backs on the money. There were offers for paid interviews, for exclusive rights, and for the photographs themselves. Strangers would arrive at their door with cash in hand, hoping to buy a way into the phenomenon. But the Trents shook their heads. They never charged a single penny to the curiosity seekers who trampled their grass or to the researchers who spent hours taking measurements of their property. To them, the event was a burden, not a business opportunity. They viewed the photographs as a record of a truth they didn't fully understand, and to sell that truth felt like a betrayal of their own integrity. They remained in their modest home, working the same land, while the world around them built a temple of myth out of their two simple snapshots. As the weeks turned into months, the negatives of the photographs, the physical evidence of their experience, became a source of further frustration. They had been promised that the negatives would be returned after they were used for publication, but they vanished into the machinery of the media. Life magazine told the couple they had been misplaced, a loss that would last for nearly 17 years until they were rediscovered in the files of a news service in 1967. The Trents didn't fight for them. They didn't hire lawyers or demand compensation. They simply went back to the soil. There is a profound sadness in the way they eventually came to view the event. In later years, they would admit that if they could go back to that overcast evening in May, they might have left the camera on the shelf. The fame hadn't brought them joy. It had only brought a lingering suspicion from neighbors and a permanent end to their privacy. Even as the decades passed, the scrutiny never truly faded. Every new generation of investigators would arrive with more advanced equipment, looking for the telltale signs of a thread or a trick of the light. Paul and Evelyn lived until 1998 and 1997 respectively, and until their final breaths, they maintained the same humble posture. They were two witnesses to something impossible, caught in the gears of a global obsession. They stood as the quiet center of a storm that never stopped swirling. As you listen now, imagine the weight they carried, the weight of being believed by many and doubted by others, all while trying to lead a life defined by the simple turning of the seasons. The light over the Oregon hills eventually softened, but the questions remained, echoing in the air long after the last visitor had driven away from the farm. By the time the calendar turned to the late 1960s, the world had changed. But the mystery of the Trent farm remained frozen in those two black and white frames. 17 years had passed since Paul and Evelyn watched that silver disc tilt against the Oregon sunset. The photographs had lived many lives, printed in local papers, featured in the glossy pages of Life magazine, and debated in hushed tones across kitchen tables. But in 1966, the investigation moved from the realm of public curiosity into the cold, clinical halls of academia. The United States Air Force, facing mounting pressure to provide a definitive answer on the nature of unidentified flying objects, funded a massive scientific inquiry at the University of Colorado. This group, famously known as the Condon Committee, was led by the distinguished physicist Edward Condon. Their mission was to strip away the folklore and apply the most rigorous tools of modern science to the most credible cases in the history of the phenomenon. And at the very top of their list were the two snapshots from McMinnville. The man tasked with peering into the heart of these images was Dr. William Hartman, an astronomer and physicist with a keen eye for the mechanics of light. Imagine him sitting in a quiet room, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and the faint, ozone tang of laboratory equipment. Before him lay the original negatives, those thin strips of acetate that held the only physical record of a few fleeting seconds in 1950. To a casual observer, the photos were simply eerie, but to Hartman, they were a complex map of data points. He began a process called photogrammetry, a method of using photographs to measure the physical distances between objects. He wasn't looking at the saucer as a craft yet. He was looking at it as a source of light and shadow, a shape occupying a three-dimensional space that could, in theory, be calculated with mathematical precision. He worked slowly, his movements deliberate, as he sought to determine if the object was a small model held just feet from the lens or a massive structure hovering hundreds of yards away. One of the most fascinating techniques Hartman employed involved the study of atmospheric extinction and scattering. It is a concept we see every day without naming it. The way distant mountains appear slightly hazy or blue because of the thick layer of air and dust between our eyes and the horizon. Hartman realized that if the object in the photos was truly far away, the light reflecting off its surface should show signs of this atmospheric interference. He carefully analyzed the contrast and brightness of the disk's underside. He compared it to the darkest shadows of the farmhouse and the bright, clear sky above. If the object were a small model hanging from a wire just a few feet away, its shadows would be sharp and deep, unaffected by the miles of air that soften the features of a distant landscape. But as he measured the light, a surprising pattern began to emerge. The data suggested that the object was not close to the camera. It seemed to be hundreds, perhaps even thousands of feet away, bathed in the same soft, scattering light as the distant hills of the Willamette Valley. To ground his findings in reality, Hartman looked for a mundane point of comparison within the frame. His eyes settled on the large oil tank sitting near the farmhouse. This tank was a known quantity, a solid metal cylinder of a certain size and distance. He meticulously measured how much light reflected off the top of the tank and how deep the shadows pooled beneath its belly. Then, he performed the same measurements on the flying disc. In a world of terrestrial logic, a nearby model would have shown shadows far darker than the distant tank. Yet, the photometer revealed a startling truth. The underside of the disc was actually lighter than the underside of the oil tank. This suggested that the disc was being influenced by light scattering from the ground and the horizon across a vast distance. It was as if the atmosphere itself was testifying on behalf of the Trents, providing a silent, scientific confirmation that the object was indeed a large, distant craft, rather than a clever piece of stagecraft performed with a pie pan or a truck mirror. The final report issued by the Condon Committee was largely skeptical of the UFO phenomenon as a whole, concluding that most sightings were the result of misidentified stars, planes, or weather balloons. However, when it came to the McMinnville case, the language shifted into something far more profound. Hartman wrote that this was one of the few reports in which all factors investigated, geometric, psychological, and physical, appeared to be consistent with the assertion that an extraordinary flying object had flown within sight of the witnesses. He described it as a silvery, metallic, disc-shaped craft, tens of meters in diameter, and evidently artificial. For a brief moment in the history of science, the impossible had been given a seat at the table. The analysis hadn't found wires, it hadn't found double exposures, and it hadn't found evidence of a hoax. Instead, it had found a physical object that defied every conventional explanation the scientists could throw at it, leaving the world to wonder what exactly had been caught in those 2 frames of film. As Hartman concluded his study, the negatives were returned to their storage, but the weight of his words lingered in the air. The scientific inquiry had not closed the case. It had only deepened the mystery by validating the strange reality of that evening in 1950. He had looked through the microscope and seen something that shouldn't exist, a craft of unknown origin, moving silently through the Oregon sky. Even as he admitted that a very clever fabrication could never be 100% ruled out, the simplest and most direct interpretation of the physics led him back to the same conclusion as the humble farmers who had first seen it. The truth was etched in the grain of the film, waiting for the next generation of seekers to arrive with their own questions. For now, the images remained as they always were, two silent witnesses to a moment when the mundane and the miraculous met in the fading light of a spring evening. By the middle of the 1970s, the world had begun to settle into a new rhythm, yet the mysteries of 1950 refused to be silenced. In 1975, a man named Dr. Bruce Maccabee entered the narrative. An optical physicist for the United States Navy, Maccabee brought with him a mind sharpened by the study of light and its many secrets. He did not seek the negatives for fame, but for the raw data they held within their microscopic layers. He traveled to the offices of the News Register, where the original film had been kept in a quiet, cool storage. As he held those thin strips of acetate, he knew that the technology of his era could peel back layers of evidence that had been invisible to the naked eye decades prior. The air in his laboratory was likely filled with the faint scent of chemicals and the soft, rhythmic hum of specialized machinery. A sanctuary where the chaos of the outside world faded away, leaving only the physics of the past to be decoded. Maccabee's primary tool was a device known as a densitometer. Imagine, if you will, a machine designed to measure the very density of the silver grains embedded in the film. When light strikes a camera's film, it creates a physical change in the chemistry of the strip, leaving a record of exactly how many photons touched that specific spot. To use a densitometer is to engage in a delicate dance with the shadows. Maccabee began to scan the images, point by point, measuring the darkness of the barn, the gray of the sky, and the metallic sheen of the object. He was looking for more than just a shape. He was looking for the way light interacted with the atmosphere itself. In his quiet workspace, the needle of the meter would sway, translating the visual world of the Trent farm into a language of numbers and light values. It was a painstaking process, requiring a stillness that matched the silence of the photographs themselves. Central to his investigation was a concept known as airlight or atmospheric scattering. This is the phenomenon where the air between a camera and a distant object is not truly empty. It is filled with dust, moisture, and gas molecules that catch and scatter the light. Because of this, an object that is very far away will never appear perfectly black. It will always be softened by the light reflecting off the air in front of it. If the object in the Trent photos was a small model hanging just a few feet from the lens, there would be very little airlight between the glass and the subject. The shadows on the object would be deep and sharp. However, if the object were truly large and several hundred meters away, the physics of the atmosphere would dictate that its shadows be filled with a faint, luminous haze. Maccabee focused his instrument on the underside of the craft, comparing its brightness to the deepest shadows of the nearby barn. His measurements revealed something profound. The underside of the object was remarkably bright, too bright, he argued, to be a small piece of metal or plastic hanging in the immediate foreground. By calculating the ratio of light between the object and the sky, he found that the haze factor matched the signature of an object located at a significant distance. According to the laws of physics, for the object to have that specific level of brightness in its shadowed areas, it had to be surrounded by a vast volume of atmosphere. This suggested that the craft was not a few inches wide, but perhaps tens of meters in diameter, hovering nearly a kilometer away from Paul Trent's camera. The data seemed to breathe life back into the account the Trents had given 25 years earlier, suggesting that what they had seen was not a domestic trick of the eye, but a physical presence of immense scale. Beyond the light, Maccabee turned his attention to the geometry of the two photographs. He performed a photogrammetric analysis, which involves measuring the exact angles and positions of every element in the frame. He looked at the power lines, the eaves of the garage, and the distant horizon. By triangulating the position of the object between the first and second shots, he attempted to find where the lines of sight intersected. If the object were a model hanging from the wires, the sighting lines would cross directly under those wires. But Maccabee's calculations told a different story. He found that the sighting lines overlapped at a point much further back in the sky, far beyond the reach of the telephone poles. This geometric puzzle provided another pillar for his conclusion, that the object was moving through the vast, open sky, independent of any structure on the farm. He also scrutinized the edges of the object with a microscopic eye, searching for the telltale signs of a suspension thread. In the 1970s, high-resolution scans were becoming more sophisticated, allowing researchers to see the grain of the film as if it were a landscape of mountains and valleys. He looked for a break in the grain, a straight line of silver that might indicate a nylon string or a wire. Despite his exhaustive search, he could find no evidence of a physical support. To Maccabee, the object appeared to be drifting through the air entirely on its own, a solid, three-dimensional entity that defied easy explanation. The more he looked, the more the simple, hoax theory seemed to crumble under the weight of his densitometric data. For him, the physics did not lie. The light had left a record that could not be easily dismissed as a prank. As his study concluded in the late 1970s, the scientific community found itself once again divided. While some remained skeptical, suggesting that perhaps a very fine thread could remain invisible even to a densitometer, Maccabee's work added a sophisticated layer of defense to the Trent case. He had moved the conversation from a matter of personal trust to a matter of measurable photons. The photographs were no longer just pictures. They were documents of light and distance, frozen in time on a humid evening in Oregon. As the decade came to a close, the McMinnville images stood as a monolith in the field of ufology, bolstered by the cold, impartial math of an optical physicist. The shadows remained, but they were now measured, quantified, and heavy, with the implication that something truly massive had once silently glided over the clover fields of the Trent farm. As the study concluded in the late 1970s, the scientific community found itself once again divided. While some remained skeptical, suggesting a simple trick of the eye or a playful hoax, others saw the fingerprints of the unknown. But the true shadows of doubt began to lengthen when the professional skeptics arrived on the scene. Men like Philip J. Klass and Robert Schieffer brought with them a cold, clinical lens, one that looked past the wonder of the story and deep into the silver halide grains of the film itself. They were not looking for craft from another world. They were looking for the strings that held the world together. For them, every mystery had a mundane heart, and the McMinnville photographs were no exception. They began to dismantle the event, piece by piece, starting with the very light that had captured the image so many years before. The most significant blow to the Trent story came from the shadows. If you look closely at the first photograph, you can see the side of a garage on the left. Skeptics pointed out that the way the light falls across the rough wood and the eaves of that building tells a very specific story about the sun. While Paul and Evelyn insisted they had seen the object in the early evening, around 7:30 as the day was beginning to fade, the skeptics argued the math did not add up. By analyzing the angle and length of those shadows, they claimed the photographs were actually taken in the morning, perhaps around 7 or 8 in the morning. To them, this was a smoking gun. If the Trents had lied about the time of day, they argued, then the entire encounter was likely a fabrication, a carefully staged performance carried out in the quiet hours of a May morning before the chores of the day had fully begun. Then came the theory of the object itself. It was not a craft of 50 feet or 100 feet in diameter, the skeptics suggested, but something much smaller and far more familiar. Philip J. Klass, often called the Sherlock Holmes of this field, looked at the shape of the disc and saw something he recognized from the everyday world of the 1950s. He pointed to the side view mirror of a 1947 or 1948 Ford truck. The rounded top, the the flat bottom, and the small offset protrusion that looked like a cockpit or an antenna. All of it matched the physical profile of a common automotive part. He proposed that Paul Trent had simply removed a mirror from a vehicle, suspended it from a thin thread, and snapped the photos in a way that made a small piece of metal look like a massive ship from the stars. It was a theory that transformed a cosmic event into a simple backyard prank. The debate over a potential suspension wire raged for decades, reaching a fever pitch with the advent of digital technology. In the original prints, the sky looks clear, a vast and empty canvas of gray. But as high-resolution scanners and computer enhancement tools became available in the late 1990s and into the new millennium, researchers claimed to find a ghostly line stretching upward from the top of the object. They looked at the power lines that crisscross the top of the frame, suggesting that a thread had been tied between them to hang the model. Some researchers, using advanced software to map the pixels, claimed to have found the break in the sky where a physical wire had been digitally smoothed over or simply lost in the grain. For those who doubted, this was the final proof, a literal string of evidence tying the saucer to the Earth. But the skeptics did not have the final word. Dr. Bruce Maccabee, an optical physicist who spent years working for the Navy, brought his own set of tools to the farm. He was a man who understood the physics of light better than most. He conducted a series of densitometric tests, measuring how light scatters through the atmosphere. He argued that if the object were a small model close to the camera, the contrast and the way the light hit its underside would look very different. Because of the haze in the air, a phenomenon called atmospheric scattering, objects that are far away lose their sharpest contrast. Maccabee's data suggested the saucer was indeed a large object, hundreds of feet away, and not a small piece of metal hanging just a few feet from the lens. He looked for that elusive thread with the eyes of a scientist and found nothing that convinced him of a hoax. To him, the physics pointed toward something massive and distant. Beyond the math and the pixels, there remained the human element, the part of the story that no computer could fully solve. Paul and Evelyn Trent were not seekers of fame. They did not sell their story to the highest bidder. In fact, they were famously reluctant to share the photos at all, waiting weeks to finish the roll of film before taking it to be developed. They lived out their lives on that same plot of land, becoming older as the mystery grew younger and more vibrant around them. Until their final breaths in the late 1990s, they never wavered. They spoke of the object with a quiet, persistent sincerity that troubled the skeptics. If it was a lie, it was a lie they carried for nearly 50 years without a single crack. As we listen to the wind over the fields of Oregon, we are left to wonder which is more likely: a complex, lifelong deception, or a single moment where the impossible became visible. Not people who sought the bright lights of a stage, nor were they ever interested in the fleeting nature of fame. They were people of the earth, defined by the seasons and the heavy, rich soil of their farm near Sheridan. After the initial storm of 1950 had passed, after the reporters had packed their heavy cameras, and the investigators from the Air Force had finished their pointed questioning, the Trents did something remarkable. They simply went back to work. For the next several decades, the world outside their farmhouse continued to spin faster and faster, fueled by the Cold War and a growing obsession with the silver screens of cinema and the stars above. Yet on that quiet patch of Oregon land, time seemed to move with a different rhythm. The sun would rise over the hills, casting long, familiar shadows across the same yard where Evelyn had once stood with her rabbit cages. The utility wires still hummed in the wind, stretching between the house and the garage, indifferent to the mystery they had once framed in a moment of history. In those long, peaceful years, the Trents lived a life of quiet dignity, far removed from the sensational headlines they had inadvertently authored. There is a particular kind of weight to a memory when it is held for a lifetime, but for Paul and Evelyn, it never felt like a burden they were hiding. It was simply a fact of their history, as real as the fences they mended or the crops they harvested. One of the most striking aspects of the McMinnville case, and perhaps the reason it persists in the hearts of researchers, is the total absence of greed. In an era where many sought to capitalize on the public's fascination with flying saucers, the Trents stood apart like a tall oak in an open field. They never asked for money. They never sold their story to the highest bidder or toured the country as professional witnesses. In fact, they were often reluctant to speak of the event at all. Paul would later remark that he wished he had never taken the pictures, not because they weren't authentic, but because of the relentless attention they brought to his doorstep. To them, the photographs were a duty to the truth rather than a ticket to fortune. When the original negatives were lost or misplaced by a television production in New York City, Paul did not pursue them with legal fire. He let them go, perhaps secretly hoping that the world might finally let him be just a farmer again. As the decades rolled by, the questions did not stop, yet the answers never changed. Researchers and skeptics alike would find their way to the Trent home, seeking some small crack in the foundation of their story. They would sit in the living room, the air thick with the scent of old wood and the soft, gray light of the Pacific Northwest, and they would ask the same things that had been asked in the 1950s. They wanted to know where exactly the couple had been standing, what the metal looked like under the evening sun, and if the object had made any sound at all. Through hundreds of interviews over nearly 50 years, the account remained unshakable. Paul and Evelyn spoke with the calm, steady cadence of people who have nothing to invent. Their descriptions remained consistent down to the smallest detail, from the way the object tilted to the silence of its movement and the incredible speed at which it vanished toward the west. This consistency is a rare jewel in the world of unexplained phenomena. Usually, stories grow or change with the passage of time, becoming more elaborate or crumbling under the weight of fading memory. But the Trent's account remained as stark and unadorned as the black and white film that had first captured the world's imagination. In the town of McMinnville and the surrounding countryside, the perspective of the community served as a silent guardian of the Trent's reputation. In small farming communities, honesty is more than just a virtue. It is a currency. Your neighbors know the quality of your character long before they know the details of your private life. To those who lived alongside Paul and Evelyn, the idea of them concocting an elaborate hoax was almost laughable. They were seen as plain-spoken, hardworking, and deeply grounded individuals. They were the kind of people who would help a neighbor with a broken tractor or share the bounty of their garden without a second thought. This local trust formed a protective shell around the couple. When skeptics from faraway cities would publish papers claiming the photos were faked with a truck mirror or a simple model, the people of Yamhill County would look at the couple they had known for a lifetime and simply shake their heads. They knew Paul, they knew Evelyn, and they knew that these were not the type of people to spend half a century maintaining a lie for absolutely no reward. Their neighbor's belief was not based on physics or optics, but on the integrity of two lives well lived. In their twilight years, Paul and Evelyn eventually left the hard labor of the farm behind, moving into a retirement home in the heart of McMinnville. Even there, as the shadows of age grew longer and their steps became slower, they remained united in their testimony. Evelyn was the first to depart, passing away in 1997. She left behind a legacy of quiet strength, a woman who had seen something impossible and never felt the need to apologize for it. Paul followed her just a year later, in February of 1998. Until his very last breath, he maintained that what he saw that evening in 1950 was real, artificial, and utterly unknown. He died as he had lived, without pretense and without regret. Shortly after his passing, the town they had called home decided to embrace the mystery fully, establishing an annual festival that would grow to be one of the largest of its kind in the nation. Today, thousands of people walk the streets of McMinnville every May, looking up at the sky and wondering. They celebrate the photographs, but more than that, they celebrate the honesty of the two people who took them. The decades of silence from the Trents have become a powerful testament in the history of the unexplained. A reminder that sometimes, the most extraordinary truths are held by the most ordinary hands. Paul and Evelyn spent their final years in that quiet retirement home, just a few miles from the farm where history had once descended upon their chicken coop. Evelyn left this world first, in 1997, and Paul followed her just a year later, in February of 1998. They had lived nearly 8 decades of life, most of it defined by the hard, honest work of the soil, but their names would forever be tethered to those 30 seconds in May of 1950. They died as they had lived, quietly, without wealth, and without ever changing a single detail of their story. To the very end, they insisted that what they saw was real, and that the photographs were exactly what they appeared to be. The farm they left behind eventually grew quiet, the old barn aging under the soft Oregon rain. But the images they captured began to take on a life of their own, growing more significant with every passing decade, as they transitioned from local news to global legend. When we look at those photographs today, we are not just looking at a mystery, we are looking at the physical texture of a bygone era. The film was black and white, captured on a humble folding camera that required a steady hand and a patient heart. There is a specific grain to the images, a softness that modern digital sensors can never replicate. In those frames, the sky over the Willamette Valley is a pale, milky gray, and the object itself, that strange, discoidal craft with its off-center tower, floats with a haunting weightiness. Analysts like Dr. Bruce Maccabee would spend hundreds of hours peering into that grain, measuring the way the light reflected off the underside of the metallic hull. He found that the shadows on the object matched the shadows on the ground perfectly, suggesting that it was not a small model held close to the lens, but a massive structure, perhaps 30 meters across, hovering in the distant air, exactly as the Trents had described. The scientific community, often quick to dismiss such claims, found itself unusually silent when it came to the Trent case. Even the government-funded Condon Committee, led by the skeptical physicist Edward Condon in the late 1960s, could not find a way to debunk the images. Their lead investigator, William Hartman, wrote that this was one of the few reports where every factor, the geometry of the scene, the psychological profile of the witnesses, and the physical evidence of the film, appeared to be consistent with the presence of an extraordinary, silvery, metallic object. It was a rare admission of the unknown. Over the years, skeptics tried to propose that the object was a truck's rearview mirror or a lid from a trash can, but no one could ever prove how a simple farming couple could have faked such a sophisticated optical illusion without leaving a single trace of a wire or a thread on the original negatives. McMinnville itself eventually embraced the mystery that had put it on the map. Every May, the town transforms into a sea of silver and light. In 1999, the first festival was held to celebrate the approaching 50th anniversary of the sighting. What began as a local gathering at the historic Hotel Oregon grew into the second-largest UFO festival in the country. People walked down 3rd Street, dressed in silver suits and alien masks, laughing under the spring sun. It is a strange, joyful legacy for a story that started with a woman feeding her rabbits in the mud. But beneath the costumes and the parades, there is a deep, lingering respect for the Trents. Their neighbors knew them as people of integrity, the kind of folks who did not lie for profit. They never asked for money for their photos, and they were often reluctant to even talk about them, fearing they would be ridiculed or targeted by a government they did not fully trust. The original negatives of the photographs have a history as strange as the sighting itself. They were lost in the files of news agencies for 17 years, misplaced by national magazines, and eventually rediscovered and returned to the family through the persistence of researchers. They have been poked, prodded, and scanned by the world's most advanced technology, yet they keep their secrets close. Some believe that the final truth is hidden in those silver halide crystals, a definitive proof that we are not alone. Others see only a clever trick of the light and a legacy of misidentification. But perhaps the true power of the McMinnville photographs is not in their proof, but in the way they allow us to wonder. They represent a moment when the mundane world of a small farm touched something vast and incomprehensible, leaving behind only 2 small squares of film as a reminder of that silent, metallic visitor. As the sun sets over Yamhill County today, the landscape looks much as it did on that Thursday evening in 1950. The hills are a deep, rolling green, and the air carries the scent of damp earth and blooming wildflowers. The power lines still stretch across the fields, humming quietly in the breeze. We may never know for certain what Paul and Evelyn saw as they stood in their backyard, shielding their eyes against the evening light. But as we look up at the deepening blue of the twilight sky, we can feel the weight of their story. It is a story of a mystery that refused to go away, a story that remains as clear and as haunting as it was 75 years ago. The farm is still, the cameras are put away, and the witnesses have found their peace in the earth they once tended. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.